Hi, Dr. Corbett. Thank you for your patience with me while I wrap up this incomplete presentation. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to be doing my presentation on Leonora Carrington, who is a surrealist artist that lived from 1917 to 2011. I wanted to explore her life and work for a couple of reasons. First and foremost being that she is my personal favorite artist. I feel very emotionally and spiritually connected to her work, but also her work is inherently depth psychological due to its mystical influences, its fairy tale-like ethereal imagery, and the deeply archetypal quality of her life and work. She has a very archetypally feminine presence and emanates much needed wisdom for these current times. In my research, my two primary references were these books written by Susan Alberth, who is kind of the foremost historian and expert on Leonora's work. She was close friends with her for a 10-year period. They collaborated together on her biography, and she's been studying and researching her work for several decades. So I think it was the closest I could get to the source. Leonora was very private, so it is kind of hard to find firsthand accounts of her work and her inner workings. I included a lot of pictures also, I will say, because I think her artwork speaks more to her inner world and her personal psychology than anything else that exists. So starting in her early life, she was born in 1917 to nouveau riche parents. Her father was a huge textile producer and her mother was an Irish immigrant. And they really sought to raise her in this wealthy, high society lifestyle. She grew up feeling a strong connection to her Irish heritage, which was a mixture of Indigenous, pagan, and as well as Catholic influences. Her Irish relatives believed that she was a descendant of the ancient fairy folk, and she believed that as well. And she was very interested in the mystical and imaginal realm from a young age. She was also rumored to have psychic abilities. She began drawing a deck of tarot cards at age 13 that she continued on throughout her life. And she was specifically interested in the archetype of the hanged man, which you can see here. So her painting from her deck. I interpret that as an indicator of her ability to see things differently than most people, as well as her ability to engage with and surrender to the magical, mythical, liminal realms. Much to her parents' dismay, she did not neatly fit into the debutante lifestyle. She was later quoted saying that she had an allergy to education, and she cycled through various boarding schools, the bulk of which she was expelled from. Eventually, her parents decided she was, quote, unteachable, and sought to debut her as a debutante in the court of Charles V so that she could be married off. But in a similar fashion, she refused and resisted that, and it likewise did not work out. Her parents were not supportive of her dream of being an artist, but they eventually allowed her to attend art school. As I read about her history and I listen to interviews about her life, she really seemed to have an extraordinary connection with Psyche and innately did what she felt called to do, regardless of societal and family pressures, which continued to press on her for the following years. I believe that the rigid structure and expectations within her family system and family culture are what ushered her into this imaginal realm where she pulled all of her inspiration. So she lasted in art school for 1 year before she dropped out. And at the age of 20, she met the prominent surrealist artist Max Ernst. He was 46 at the time and married, but they fell in love regardless. She moved to Paris and they quickly became a couple as well as artistic collaborators. They were both heavily into all things related to the occult and integrated it into their work. In Paris, she was able to meet and work with all of the prominent surrealists. And despite the movement being very much a kind of men's club, she was reported to be beloved by everyone, both in regards to her personality and her work. This is where the embodiment of the Puella archetype really starts appearing and solidifying. And it seemed to me, from what I can see, that Ernst really seemed to take on this kind of Senex role, and they balanced each other out in that way. Sorry. She had two nicknames given to her by her fellow surrealists. One was Femme Girl, or Femme Enfant, girl child, and the other was Femme Sociée, witch woman. And she was reported to be very mystical, magical, bright, fun, silly, and overall enjoyable to be around. My hypothesis is that this outward kind of sunny disposition was a kind of mask for very intuitive, dark, kind of mystical underpinnings underneath. Just before World War II, she and Ernst moved to the south of France, and quickly thereafter, Ernst was deemed an enemy of war due to his political leanings. He and the bulk of the surrealists were very heavily socialist, and he was placed in a French prisoner of war camp. She was able to escape, but while she was fleeing, she had what she referred to herself as a, quote, mental break, and she was placed in an asylum. This appeared to be a massive underworld journey for her, and she documented it here, as you can see in this book of writings called Down Below, which reads as very dark, very harrowing, kind of chaotic, truly a dark underworld journey. It was also the first person account of a woman's descent into madness, and is described as a quote unquote alchemical parable. She was eventually released to her family's nanny, and as they were on the train for her to make her way back to her family, she fled to the Mexican embassy, where she had a mutual friend through Pablo Picasso named Renato Leduc, who was a poet. Her parents still had a plan and the right to legally institutionalize her, and so Renato kindly offered to marry her, and they traveled together and wed before moving to Mexico in 1942, which was one of the only places where World War II refugees were offered citizenship with no questions asked. So her time in Mexico is really where she seemed to emotionally, creatively, spiritually, artistically bloom. She spent the remainder of her life in Mexico City, and she fell deeply in love with the mysticism and heritage of the city, and really dove into the local culture, learning everything she could about the indigenous people. She was able to connect with an enclave of surrealist refugees there, and was immersed in a community of artists and writers, one of which she ended up marrying after separating from her green card marriage. However, the most prominent relationship in her life that we can see was her close friendship and collaboration with Remedios Varo, who was another female surrealist painter who also lived in Mexico City. There are numerous similarities between them, between their work. As you can see here, the image on the left is a painting by Remedios, and this painting in the center is a painting by Leonora. There is a lot of overlap there. And in the third photograph, that is a picture of Remedios wearing a large mask made by Leonora. They both really demonstrated enormous receptivity to their surroundings. They're very deeply interested in the occult and the metaphysical and magical practices. which was all around them in Mexico City. It was very part of the indigenous culture. They were also big supporters of local art and craft, and they remained engaged with their local community throughout their lives. Together, they routinely went to the witches' market and met with brujas and studied indigenous magic practices. They were also both likewise influenced by their Catholic upbringings and by Catholic mysticism. And both of them as children had separately had visions as youths of saints levitating. They frequently hid runes and sigils in their work, and they engaged in private rituals together. Leonora described Remedios as the, quote, most intelligent person she had ever met, and they seemed to take on a kind of Huala-Senex relationship, balancing each other out in this beautiful, well-rounded way. They painted together every day, and throughout their friendship, they were able to deepen their art practices. That being said, Leonora stated that she would not divulge details of their friendship to outside people because their relationship was considered sacred by both of them. And this is a time where both of them create the bulk of their work. Most of the paintings that we see now by both of them come from this long time period of them living in Mexico, working together, maintaining spiritual practices with one another, maintaining close friendship, and taking in the culture surrounding them. So Leonora, she grew up, she grew old, she had 2 children, but her personal experiences and life events weren't widely shared because she, as a feminist, she was a very politically oriented and a very hardcore feminist. She wanted to make sure that her public face was focused on her work. She didn't want to be represented as a wife or a mother or any other traditional female role that is often portrayed in the media, but rather wanted to be regarded for her work and for her huge contribution to the Surrealist movement. She was very forthright about her belief that art making is a magical practice and that liminal spaces are of value and worthy of exploration and consideration. She passed in 2011 and her work has since become more and more widely recognized. And I believe it will continue to do so because it really embodies the antithesis of the overtly rational and toxically masculine culture that we're currently entrenched in. And that is the end of my presentation. I could go on and on and on about her forevermore, but I will not. And yeah, thank you for a wonderful course. This has been so invigorating and lovely, and I've really enjoyed the opportunity to kind of connect with people and artists and things that I've found very touching to me. So thank you.